Now that we've seen DRS clusters, in this video we're going to take a look at adding high availability to our cluster. In DRS, what we're concerned with is distributing virtual machines amongst the hosts in the cluster so that we have a statistically even load balance. HA is a little bit different. HA doesn't use vMotion at all. HA is about monitoring the hosts and also monitoring the virtual machines running on that host in order to be able to restart them in the event that that host fails, or be able to restart a virtual machine in the event that it's not responding, whereas its VMware tools is actually not responding to VMware anymore. Maybe that machine has entered into a panic state or a blue screen or whatever it is for the operating system of the guest, and we can have HA restart that virtual machine for us. So I already have a cluster created, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into its settings and we're going to add HA along with DRS. So we'll see in our cluster features section of this dialog, we have an option, turn on vSphere HA. Pretty simple to do. There are some options that we're going to have to consider. And one of the biggest problems that we have to deal with is when we have machines that might have lost connectivity, for example, with the rest of the cluster, the HA service needs to be able to determine to some extent whether that's a local failure indicating a problem on that host, or whether it's a failure of some other host telling us that this is the host that's good. When we start losing network connectivity, maybe in a 2-node cluster, they're both running, maybe they both have access to storage, one has access to the network, one doesn't. How do we know which one is which? So one of the major issues that we have to figure out is how we're going to determine who has the best health state and try to make sure that those are the systems that are going to continue to stay up and operating, even if we have a partial failure of various components within the cluster. Let's go in and set the options. You'll see that I now have vSphere HA options inside this dialog. We'll see that we have a few things that we can set. The host monitoring is the fundamental feature of HA, so we don't want to turn that off. But if we were doing maintenance, if for some reason we didn't want HA to be active, we could turn it off. Now, again, when we go to shut down hosts, we're going to use maintenance mode, so that will prevent workload from being sent there and so on. So generally speaking, across the cluster, we're going to want to use monitoring. But for specific hosts, we might use maintenance mode in order to say that they're not participating right now. And that applies also to DRS too. So maintenance mode is really the key. And then notice we have this admission control options. And this is rather important. If we've started to do resource reservations, then we want to ensure that when hosts within the cluster fail, that we can still honor the reservations that we've set. So in this case, what will happen is if we turn on admission control in the cluster, we can specify a certain amount of resources to set aside, and every time virtual machines start, there's going to be an additional calculation taken into account to determine whether or not the cluster can actually provide the resources that the virtual machine is asking. So we can specify whether we want to do that or not. I'm going to leave this enabled. You notice that you can specify a specific number of host failures that you're willing to tolerate. You'll also see that we have an option to specify a certain percentage of resources that are reserved as spare capacity. Or we could also designate specific failover hosts to always be used. Now we have to be a little bit careful because once we start using admission control, we're actually going to potentially not use those resources effectively as we might otherwise. So if I was to click failover hosts, we could just click edit here and just select the hosts out of the cluster that we want to not take any live workload until something bad has happened in the cluster. You'll also notice that we have an advanced options button here. Now that actually is fairly important because when we start trying to monitor the hosts, what we may find is that the hosts are in communication with each other. Lots of ways in which hosts in a cluster might have connectivity to each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have connectivity to the outside world. So one of the components of monitoring is having the hosts monitor each other. We can also have them monitor external addresses, for example. So in here, we can add various additional options. And if you take a look in the HA guide, we can specify things like the isolation address that's going to be tested. Typically, that's going to be the default gateway that's configured for the host. Definitely take a look at the HA cluster guide on VMware's site for more details of the different options you can set here. I'm actually going to turn off admission control just to make sure I don't run into any major resource problems. And if we take a look at virtual machine options, we can actually specify on a virtual machine basis how we'd like this all to be carried out. So much like when we do a vMotion, we can specify a priority. HA is not based on vMotion. When the original host fails, when we lose communication with it, the virtual machine is going to shut down. Probably hard if the host actually failed, or if the host is in a not great state, then what we may want to do is actually shut down the virtual machines before we try taking them over somewhere else. do a cleaner transfer of control. If we look in here, we can see that when we do the host isolation response, this is where the host is running, but for whatever reason, this host is not able to talk to the other hosts. So it basically can determine that it's the source of the problem, that it needs to do a clean shutdown of the virtual machines so they can be taken over somewhere else. So what we can do is we could say just to leave it running, or typically what we're going to do is do a proper shutdown. Now that's going to take longer because we're going to wait for the shutdown to happen on the original host before one of the other hosts that's in a better health state can take over, but is definitely the safest option. Or we can do a hard power off, which would be about the same level of impact as if the host had actually failed. So we can specify what level of priority, how much resources should be applied while virtual machines are being restarted by HA. Now, of course, the more hosts that we have, especially if we have DRS, that's going to help optimize the placement of those virtual machines. This is how much impact it's going to have on the existing virtual machines that are already running when we go to start these other ones. We could have it take longer for them to boot with less impact on the running virtual machines, or faster to boot and restore service for that service more quickly, although with an impact on performance on the other virtual machines. So in this case, I'll just leave that at medium. I've got my host isolation response. And if for whatever reason I have a virtual machine that I want to be more aggressive with, for example, maybe it's a domain controller or something like that, then what we might find is that specific virtual machines we want to be a higher priority maybe than others. Or for certain virtual machines that need to be shut down for safety, and then I have other virtual machines that maybe I could do a hard power off because everything those machines do is volatile in a RAM disk or something like that, then we could change the host isolation response for each VM as well. Now, it's very important to understand, however, if you go into the properties of a host, if you go into the configuration of a host, you have the option to set virtual machine startup and shutdown settings. That'll be done automatically. That does not work in HA. So we can configure a standalone ESXi host that when we start the host, it automatically starts its virtual machines. And of course, that's what you'd want. The general concept with an HA cluster is that it's available all the time, or something in the cluster should be available all the time for protecting that environment well and doing proper change management and have a disciplined operation. Certainly that's not always necessarily going to be the case. If we need to do a complete data center shutdown for power work or something like that, what you may be surprised to find is that if you start up all of the nodes in an HA cluster when none of them are online, you'll actually have no virtual machines that come online automatically, and you'll need to go power them on, which is not overly difficult. Of course, we can just use our vSphere client, connect to vCenter, and then just select all those virtual machines and start them up, right? Well, the biggest challenge that could come up here is where our vCenter is a virtual machine, and that's completely supported. That's a popular configuration. It's not necessarily the most scalable configuration. It's not an ideal configuration for everybody, but you could do it. So in that case, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty because you're going to have to start that virtual machine manually, but you would normally be connecting to that virtual machine in order to manage VMware. So what we're going to need to do is connect to the host that owns that virtual machine currently, that it's currently registered with, connect directly to the host with the vSphere client, then start up vCenter, and then maybe connect into vCenter with the client again once it's up and running to do the rest of the cluster. This can be a little bit tricky when you're using DRS because, of course, DRS might be moving your vMotion virtual machine all over the place. That's supported and it works. HA can protect your vCenter virtual machine, so that's good. If one of your hosts fails and another was already running, then the vCenter will just be restarted on that other host. But a complete cold startup of the cluster is going to require you to actually manually intervene to bring up those virtual machines. So this can be a little bit tricky. Just a few more options here, and then we'll finish off this video and do some somewhat destructive testing, and we'll start shutting down hosts and see what happens to their workload. So under VM monitoring, we can actually have VMware tools be monitored with a heartbeat, and if VMware tools is not responding for whatever reason, that we can go ahead and have those virtual machines restarted. So we can choose VM monitoring, which monitors VM tools. If your VM is actually running services that are integrated with VMware tools that have integrated application monitoring, we can do heartbeating there as well. This is going to require specific support from your applications. So I'll leave that at VM monitoring. And then you'll also notice we can specify the monitoring sensitivity. So if we have a high sensitivity, it will look for virtual machines that are not responding for 30 seconds, and we'll restart them up to 3 times an hour. If we go to medium, we can see that it waits 1 minute to restart the virtual machine if the heartbeats aren't met. And then we can see that the HA restarts the virtual machine after 3 failures per day. This might be still a little bit overly aggressive, if you have a lot of load problems or anything like that in the virtual machine. If VMware Tools is not able to respond for some reason, we may have HA restarting that virtual machine and moving it somewhere else. So we want to be a little bit careful with all this. If we change it to low, then we can say it waits 2 minutes and does 3 restarts per week for that virtual machine. So this actually might not be terrible. If we have virtual machines that are blue screening or whatever the equivalent is in whatever other operating systems you're using, it's not necessarily something we just want to patch over by having VMware constantly restart it and move it around. However, if you have some machines that are better behaved or worse behaved than others, we can override that on a VM by VM basis. And if we go to custom, you can see you can actually change the failure interval, how soon we'll restart after the previous failure. We can also see a minimum uptime. So if the machine comes up and immediately crashes and shuts down again, we can actually just not even bother trying to bring it back if we can't get some kind of stable work out of it. And we can change the maximum number of resets and the time window for those resets. We also have an option here for data store heartbeating. This is going to help improve the safety. It's going to help improve the rigorousness of the health checking that the hosts are going to do when they go to come up by actually making sure that a specific number of data stores is available to each of the hosts that are in the cluster. When you initially set up HA, it will take any of the cluster data stores and will select them at random. If for whatever reason you have many data stores and maybe some are temporary and some are more important than others, we may want to go in and actually specify a specific number of data stores or tell it to just select any of the cluster data stores. So if we leave it at the default option, then we can go in and select the data store that we want and specify the ones that we prefer to use. Or you can say only select the preferred data stores and then select the ones that you prefer to use. So now that that's all been done and I've said okay, you'll see that we have a couple of tasks running, configuring vSphere HA on host 151 and also on 152. And we'll see that it's installing the HA agent. I'm going to let that run. We'll come back to it in another video, and then we'll take a look at troubleshooting the HA agent installation and then triggering some HA events and seeing how VMware responds.